His hands tremble uncontrollably, skin mottled with burn scars that will never heal. Thomas Mallory sits alone in the corner of a naval inquiry room, the weight of 1,500 lives pressing down on his hunched shoulders. The smell of industrial antiseptic barely masks the lingering scent of burned metal that seems permanently embedded in his nostrils. Sweat beads on his forehead as the panel of stern-faced officers stares him down. His fingernails are still rimmed with black, not dirt, but microscopic particles of Indianapolis steel that no amount of scrubbing can remove. "You violated direct orders," Admiral Morrison says coldly, voice cutting through the room like the bow of a destroyer through Pacific swells. "You performed an unauthorized repair on a United States heavy cruiser." The Admiral's ribbons catch the harsh fluorescent light, each one representing battles where men like Mallory made the difference between victory and defeat. The welder's eyes dart to the window, where rain streams down like tears. Beyond that glass, somewhere in the vast Pacific, the USS Indianapolis lies 2 miles below the surface with most of her crew. 880 men gone. And here sits Thomas Mallory, technically alive, but drowning in his own way. The man who saved the ship once, only to be blamed for its ultimate destruction. A military photographer's camera clicks in the corner, documenting this moment for records that will soon be classified. Mallory wonders if his face will become part of the official narrative, the reckless welder who thought he knew better than naval regulations. He reaches for the water glass in front of him, but his damaged hands betray him. It topples, spilling across the immaculate hearing room table. No one moves to help. How does someone become the reason hundreds initially survived, only to end up bearing the burden of their eventual deaths? What happens when your greatest achievement and most devastating failure become the same act, viewed through the lens of tragedy? 3 weeks earlier, Pearl Harbor hummed with frantic activity. The date was July 16, 1945. The war in the Pacific had reached a fever pitch as American forces were preparing for the final push toward Japan. Every vessel was critical, every repair urgent. The harbor itself was a forest of masts and radar arrays, destroyers, cruisers, support ships, all preparing for what many feared would be the bloodiest phase of the Pacific War. Repair crews worked around the clock, their welding torches creating constellations of sparks against the Hawaiian night. The USS Indianapolis, a Portland-class heavy cruiser stretching 610 feet from bow to stern, limped into the harbor after being damaged by a kamikaze attack off Okinawa. Her hull showed the scars of combat, a blackened gash along her starboard side where a Japanese pilot had made his final desperate strike. But that wasn't what worried the naval engineers who swarmed over her like anxious doctors. It was her propulsion system, specifically a critical fracture in the main reduction gearing that transferred power from her steam turbines to the massive propeller shafts. The reduction gear, a precision assembly of massive interlocking teeth and wheels, was the mechanical heart that allowed the ship's 75,000 horsepower to translate into speed. Without it, Indianapolis would be dead in the water, unable to fulfill whatever mysterious mission had command so anxious to see her return to service. The massive cracks spreading through the housing weren't just a mechanical problem. They represented a potential mission failure at the most critical juncture of the Pacific War. Naval protocol was explicit about such repairs. They required specialized facilities, certified engineers, and most importantly, time. At least 3 weeks in dry dock for a complete teardown, inspection, and reassembly. The official assessment delivered to Captain Charles McVeigh was unequivocal. Ship unfit for immediate deployment. Requires extensive propulsion system overhaul at Mare Island Naval Shipyard. But war doesn't wait for proper procedures. The Indianapolis had been selected for a special mission, one so secret that even her captain wasn't fully briefed. She needed to be underway within 72 hours. Impossible, according to every naval engineering manual ever written. That's when Chief Warrant Officer Thomas Mallory stepped forward. At 34, Mallory wasn't like the other welders. His hands, now scarred and trembling in that inquiry room, had once been legendary throughout the Pacific Fleet for their steadiness. Before the war, he'd worked experimental metallurgy for Bethlehem Steel, developing techniques that pushed the boundaries of what could be fused, repaired, and reinforced. The son of a Pennsylvania coal miner, he had an instinctive understanding of how metals behaved under extreme pressure and heat. Since Pearl Harbor in '41, he'd served on repair ships and naval bases across the Pacific. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Leyte Gulf, wherever American ships took damage, Mallory would be called in for the most challenging repairs. His methods were unorthodox, sometimes even considered reckless by naval standards. He'd once crawled into a flooded compartment of the destroyer USS O'Bannon to patch a torpedo hole while the ship was still underway. Another time, he'd repaired a carrier's elevator system using parts salvaged from a sunken Japanese vessel. "I can fix her," he told the incredulous chief engineer, pointing to the damaged reduction gear housing that everyone else had deemed beyond field repair. "Not permanently, but she'll hold together long enough for one more mission." The response was immediate and categorical. "Absolutely not. You're talking about an unauthorized procedure on a critical component of a capital ship. It's against every regulation in the book." The chief engineer, Commander Wilson, had 22 years in the Navy and had never deviated from protocol. "Do you understand what you're proposing, Mallory? If that gear housing fails at sea, the shaft could tear through the hull. She'd go down in minutes." But war has a way of bending rules when necessity demands it. After a closed-door meeting with naval intelligence officers, Captain McVeigh made an impossible choice. He authorized Mallory's repair attempt while ensuring that no official documentation would ever show this deviation from protocol. If successful, the Indianapolis would sail on schedule. If it failed, the consequences would fall squarely on one welder's shoulders. "You understand what you're risking?" McVeigh asked Mallory. The welder nodded, not yet comprehending how prophetic those words would become. The repair bay beneath the Indianapolis was a claustrophobic nightmare of scorching heat and toxic fumes. Mallory crawled into a space never designed for human access, dragging specialized equipment he'd modified himself. The reduction gear housing, a massive steel component that contained precision-machined gears transferring thousands of horsepower, had developed a hairline fracture along a critical stress point. Standard procedure required complete replacement. Mallory proposed something that had never been attempted on a naval vessel, a reinforced pressure weld using a manganese molybdenum alloy he'd been experimenting with before the war. "It's stronger than the original metal," he explained to the skeptical engineering team watching from a safe distance. "The crystalline structure actually improves after being subjected to extreme heat and pressure." Nobody fully understood what he was proposing, which only heightened their suspicion. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Flynn, the ship's chief engineer, voiced what everyone was thinking. "And if you're wrong? If that weld fails at sea?" Mallory's response was simple and haunting. "Then she breaks apart, and we all go down with her." For 22 consecutive hours, Mallory worked in conditions that pushed human endurance beyond its limits. The temperature in the confined repair space fluctuated between 130 and 160 degrees. Toxic welding gases filled his lungs despite the improvised ventilation system. His skin blistered and burned as molten metal occasionally spattered against it. The alloy he was using required precise temperature control. Too hot, and the molecular structure would weaken. Too cold, and the bond would never form properly. 3 times, medical corpsmen tried to pull him out for rest. 3 times, he refused, knowing that the complex procedure couldn't be handed off mid-process. "The crystalline structure won't stabilize if the cooling isn't controlled perfectly," he explained through cracked, dehydrated lips. "No one else knows how to do this." The ship's doctor, Lieutenant Commander Morris, eventually stopped trying to intervene, instead passing in water canteens and salt tablets on a regular schedule. "I've never seen anything like it," Morris later testified. His vital signs should have collapsed hours earlier. The heat alone would incapacitate most men in under 30 minutes. But he just kept going, like some kind of machine. Mallory refused relief, knowing that only he understood the precise technique required. As hour 18 approached, his vision began to blur. His hands, normally steady as granite, developed a slight tremor. The welder's mask he wore couldn't hide the physical toll. His face, when briefly visible during mask changes, was ghost white with exhaustion, eyes bloodshot from the constant smoke and heat. Still, he continued. By hour 20, he was working largely by feel, the tactile memory in his fingers guiding him when his eyesight faltered. "The metal tells you when it's ready," he had once explained to an apprentice. "You have to listen to it, feel how it wants to flow." Now, deep in the bowels of a wounded warship, he was having a conversation with the Indianapolis herself, coaxing her broken parts to accept his unorthodox solution. Petty Officer Samuel Graves was stationed outside the access hatch, passing tools and components as needed. A 22-year-old from Nebraska who had never seen the ocean before joining the Navy, Graves had been assigned to assist Mallory because of his slim build, able to navigate the narrow access tunnels when needed. "I'll never forget the sounds," he later recalled to investigators. The torch hissing, metal creaking under stress, and Mallory's labored breathing. Sometimes he talked to himself, or maybe to the ship. "Come on, old girl, hold together for me." After a while, I started to wonder if we were witnessing a miracle or a disaster in the making. Other members of the engineering crew took shifts monitoring from outside. Chief Machinist's mate Dennis Rodriguez made hourly reports to the bridge, where Captain McVeigh waited for news. "He's still at it, sir. Says he's making progress." By hour 20, the reports had become more concerned. "He's not looking good, Captain. Doctor says he should have stopped hours ago." Lieutenant Parker from the engine room would later describe the scene. "The whole compartment glowed like the inside of a furnace. You could see the shadow of Mallory against the bulkhead, hunched over like some kind of demon smith from mythology. None of us thought a human being could function in those conditions for more than an hour, let alone nearly a full day." As dawn broke over Pearl Harbor on July 18th, Mallory emerged from the bowels of the Indianapolis. His work clothes were soaked through with sweat and blood from numerous small burns. His eyes were sunken, skin gray from exhaustion and chemical exposure. But there was something else there, too. The quiet pride of a craftsman who has accomplished something unprecedented. "She's ready," was all he said before collapsing into the arms of waiting corpsmen. Initial tests were promising. The repaired reduction gear transferred power smoothly. Vibration analyses showed readings within acceptable parameters. The Indianapolis could sail on schedule, carrying her mysterious cargo toward Tinian Island. Before she departed, Mallory had one final conversation with Captain McVeigh. "She'll hold together for this mission, sir, but when you get back, she needs a proper overhaul. This isn't a permanent fix." McVeigh nodded, clasping the welder's raw, bandaged hand. "You've done the impossible, Mallory. Your country thanks you." Neither man knew it would be the last time they would speak. The Indianapolis departed Pearl Harbor on July 19, 1945, carrying components of the atomic bomb that would soon devastate Hiroshima. She delivered her cargo successfully to Tinian on July 26th, then proceeded toward Leyte Gulf for training exercises. What happened next has become one of the most tragic chapters in American naval history. Just after midnight on July 30th, the Japanese submarine I-58 spotted the cruiser and fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. The sea was calm, the night clear, with a quarter moon providing just enough illumination for the submarine's periscope operator to track his target. The Indianapolis, maintaining a straight course at 17 knots, had no destroyer escort. Standard procedure for most capital ships in late 1945 had been relaxed due to the presumed reduction in Japanese submarine threat. 2 torpedoes struck the Indianapolis on her starboard side. The first blew away the bow. The second hit amidship, igniting fuel tanks and powder magazines. The damage was catastrophic and immediate. Seawater rushed into the forward compartments with such force that men sleeping in their bunks were swept against bulkheads. The ship listed rapidly to starboard, emergency lighting flickering and then failing throughout much of the vessel. Captain McVeigh, awakened by the explosions, made it to the bridge to find systems already failing and communications disrupted. The radio men managed to get off a partial distress signal, but it's unclear if it was ever received by Naval Headquarters. Within 12 minutes, the mighty cruiser rolled completely over and plunged bow first into the depths.
Of the nearly 1,200 men aboard, approximately 300 went down with the ship. The remaining 900 found themselves floating in shark-infested waters with few lifeboats, limited supplies, and no immediate rescue in sight. "The sea was on fire around us," recalled Quartermaster George Horvath, "oil burning on the surface, men screaming in the darkness. Some were badly burned, others bleeding from injuries sustained during the explosions or from the scramble to abandon ship.
We had no time for an orderly evacuation. It was chaos. For 4 days, the survivors drifted in groups scattered across miles of open ocean. The worst horror began with the sunrise. Tiger sharks drawn to the blood and thrashing in the water. Men were taken in daylight, sometimes pulled screaming beneath the surface, just arm's length from their shipmates. Dehydration drove some to drink seawater, leading to hallucinations and madness. Others, covered in fuel oil, developed severe chemical burns as the tropical sun cooked the petroleum into their skin. The rescue, when it finally came, was entirely accidental. A Navy pilot on routine patrol happened to spot men in the water. By the time ships reached the scene, hundreds more had perished from exposure, dehydration, and shark attacks. Only 316 would ultimately survive the 4 days in the water, the U.S. Navy's worst disaster at sea. The raw numbers told a horrific story. 4 days in the water had claimed more lives than the actual sinking. Survivors later reported that many of their comrades had died with the name of the Indianapolis on their lips, asking with their final breaths what had happened to their ship, why she had gone down so quickly, why help had never come. Back in Pearl Harbor, news of the sinking hit Thomas Mallory like physical blow. Still recovering in the Naval Hospital from severe burns and chemical pneumonia, he received word in stages. First, that Indianapolis was lost. Then, the horrific details of the survivors' ordeal. And finally, the most devastating revelation. The official investigation was looking into potential structural failure as a contributing factor. His unauthorized repair had become the focal point of a naval inquiry seeking explanations and, perhaps, scapegoats. He collapsed when they told him about the sharks, remembered Nurse Lieutenant Eleanor Gorman, who had been caring for Mallory since his collapse after the repair. Not from physical weakness, though God knows he was still in terrible shape, but from something deeper. "I've seen men break from what they've witnessed in combat. This was different. This was a man confronting the possibility that his own actions had led to unspeakable suffering." The hospital's chief medical officer placed Mallory on suicide watch after finding him attempting to tear out the IV lines, delivering antibiotics for his chemical pneumonia. "I don't deserve treatment," he reportedly told the doctor. "Use these medicines for someone who didn't kill 800 sailors." Meanwhile, a naval disaster of this magnitude demanded answers. Indianapolis had been the flagship of the Fifth Fleet, a vessel central to Pacific operations since 1942. Her sudden loss, followed by the revelation that survivors had drifted for days without rescue due to communications failures, created a political firestorm in Washington. Someone would have to answer for this catastrophe. Captain McVeigh, having survived the sinking and the harrowing days at sea, now faced a court-martial. The only American captain to be court-martialed for losing his ship during combat in World War II. But he wasn't the only one under scrutiny. Naval authorities needed to understand how a repaired ship cleared for action had succumbed so quickly to torpedo damage. Standard naval architecture indicated that a Portland-class cruiser should have remained afloat longer, giving more crew time to abandon ship in an orderly fashion. Somewhere in the official analysis, Thomas Mallory's emergency repair became a potential culprit. The inquiry room at Mar Island Naval Shipyard was clinically bright and uncomfortably cold on September 12, 1945, a stark contrast to the infernal conditions where Mallory had performed his miracle weeks earlier. The formal setting seemed designed to intimidate. Polished oak tables, the American flag hanging still and silent, 5 senior officers in immaculate uniforms with rows of combat ribbons and stern expressions. Mallory sat alone at the witness table, still showing physical effects of his ordeal. His once powerful frame had lost 20 pounds during his hospitalization. The burns on his hands and forearms formed patterns like macabre gloves. When he reached for the water glass, the tremor in his fingers was visible from across the room. Captain Franklin, heading the inquiry panel, made a note in his leather portfolio, without looking up. "Please state your full name and rank for the record," the yeoman stenographer requested.
Thomas Edward Mallory, Chief Warrant Officer, United States Navy. His voice was still raw from the chemical damage to his lungs. The technical questioning began immediately, with Commander Wallace Harrington, a naval engineering specialist, leading the interrogation. "Walk us through the exact procedure you employed on the reduction gear housing of the USS Indianapolis." Schematics and blueprints were spread across the table, some standard naval diagrams, others hand-drawn by Mallory during his recovery to explain what he had done. His hands shook as he pointed to technical diagrams, partly from lingering nerve damage and partly from the crushing weight of what was at stake. The trembling was particularly noticeable when he traced the fracture lines on the diagram. "The primary stress crack extended 17 inches along this seam," he explained, voice strengthening slightly when discussing the technical aspects. "Standard procedure would require complete replacement of the housing, but that would have taken weeks. My approach used a high manganese alloy with molybdenum stabilizers, applied in 3 stages with precise temperature control between applications." Commander Harrington's expression remained skeptical. "This alloy compound isn't in any naval engineering manual I've reviewed." "No, sir, it's experimental. I worked with it at Bethlehem Steel before the war." Mallory's voice faltered slightly. "We were developing it for high-stress applications in battleship turret mechanisms." "So you used an unauthorized experimental alloy on a critical component of a capital ship?" The question hung in the air, damning in its simplicity. Mallory looked directly at the commander for the first time. "I used the only material and technique that could possibly work in the time available."
"The standard approach would have meant Indianapolis couldn't sail until August," Captain Franklin interrupted. "And who gave you the authority to make that determination, Chief Warrant Officer? Who decided that your experimental approach superseded established naval protocol?" "The reduction gear repair had nothing to do with the ship's integrity after torpedo strikes," Mallory insisted, avoiding the direct question about authorization that might implicate Captain McVeigh or Admiral Sterling. "The compartmentalization that failed was forward of the engine room, completely unrelated to my work." He spread his damaged hands on the table, as if trying to physically demonstrate the distance between his repair and the torpedo impact zones. But the officers seemed determined to find a procedural failure, a reason why protocol had been breached. "You performed an unauthorized modification to a critical propulsion component," repeated Commander Wallace Harrington. "A modification that allowed a compromised vessel to undertake a combat mission. Do you dispute this fact?" Mallory's response was barely audible, his voice failing him after hours of testimony. "I do not dispute that I repaired the ship when nobody else could. I dispute that my repair had anything to do with how quickly she sank." But in his heart, a terrible question had formed, one that would haunt him for decades to come. What if he was wrong? What if his repair had somehow compromised the structural integrity in ways he hadn't anticipated? What if his pride in his abilities had sent 1,500 men to sea in a fatally weakened ship? Rear Admiral William Sterling, who had tacitly approved the unorthodox repair through back channels, now faced his own dilemma. Acknowledging his role in authorizing Mallory's work would implicate senior command in bypassing safety protocols. It proved easier to let suspicion fall on an overconfident welder who had promised more than naval engineering deemed possible. "The investigation notes your objection," Sterling said coldly, "but the fact remains that standard procedure was ignored and a critical repair was conducted outside established parameters." Lieutenant Commander Joseph Flynn, who had witnessed Mallory's superhuman effort in the repair bay, finally broke the tension. "With all due respect, gentlemen, I was there. I saw what Mallory did, and I inspected the repair myself before we sailed. It was sound. More than sound. It was brilliant." His testimony provided some counterweight to the narrative forming against the welder, but the damage was done. In the official record, Thomas Mallory's emergency repair would be noted as a contributing factor requiring further investigation, naval bureaucracy's way of casting suspicion without making direct accusations. As the inquiry concluded, Mallory found himself in an impossible position, neither clearly vindicated nor officially blamed, but forever associated with the Indianapolis tragedy. Captain McVeigh faced his court-martial with dignity, despite the unprecedented addition of testimony from the Japanese submarine commander who had sunk his ship. The captain would be convicted of hazarding his vessel by failing to zigzag, though the Japanese commander himself testified that zigzagging would have made no difference. McVeigh's career was effectively over, his reputation permanently tarnished. For Thomas Mallory, the aftermath proved equally devastating, though in different ways. No formal charges were brought against him. The Navy had little interest in publicly court-martialing a welder who had followed orders from superior officers. Instead, he received a medical discharge, his severe burns and respiratory damage deemed sufficient reason to end his naval career. The official commendation he had been recommended for after completing the impossible repair was quietly withdrawn. His name appeared in no histories of the Indianapolis, his contribution erased except as an unnamed engineering modification mentioned in technical addenda to the inquiry. The psychological toll proved far heavier than any physical injuries. Mallory retreated to a small apartment in San Francisco, where nightmares of men drowning and burning ships became his regular companions. He took odd welding jobs at civilian shipyards, his extraordinary skills now employed in mundane repairs. Those who worked alongside him noted his meticulous attention to safety standards, his obsessive triple-checking of every weld. "Never takes shortcuts," one foreman commented, "acts like every piece of metal he touches might sink if he does it wrong." In 1952, 7 years after the sinking, Mallory received an unexpected visitor. Samuel Graves, the petty officer who had assisted during the marathon repair session, had spent years tracking down the welder. His search had led through naval archives, veterans' hospitals, and finally to a small welding shop in Oakland where Mallory had found work far from any military installation. The shop specialized in artistic metalwork, decorative gates, ornamental railings, custom fixtures for upscale homes in the Bay Area. Nothing that lives would depend on, nothing that could sink. Graves found him hunched over a delicate copper piece, his once massive hands now permanently contracted from scar tissue, working with a precision that defied their damaged state. Their reunion in a quiet dockside bar revealed how differently two men could experience the same tragedy. The small tavern smelled of old wood and spilled beer, fishing nets hanging from the ceiling as decoration. A radio played soft jazz in the corner. Neither man touched the drinks in front of them for the first half hour. "I've come to thank you," Graves said simply after the awkward initial conversation had exhausted itself. "My brother was on Indianapolis." He paused, the weight of what came next visible in his expression. Not the final voyage. He'd transferred to the Bennington 3 weeks earlier. But he would have been aboard if the war had continued, part of the invasion force for mainland Japan. Mallory looked up, confusion evident. Graves continued, "If Indianapolis hadn't delivered that bomb when she did, if the war hadn't ended when it did, he and thousands of others would have died invading Japan. What you did mattered, Mallory. It mattered to end that war." The words provided small comfort to a man who had internalized so much blame. Mallory's hands trembled slightly as he finally reached for his beer. "But at what cost?" he asked, voice barely audible above the gentle murmur of the bar. "How many died because I thought I knew better than naval regulations? 800 men in the water, eaten alive, Graves, while I was safe in a hospital bed." Graves shook his head firmly, leaning forward. "The torpedoes sank that ship, Tom, not your weld. Every survivor I've spoken to says the same thing. She went down because she was hit in exactly the wrong places. The fire reached the forward magazine. Nothing to do with your repair." "You can't know that for certain," Mallory countered, eyes fixed on his scarred hands. The metallurgical analysis was inconclusive. They couldn't recover enough of the ship to determine exactly how the hull failed. I've spoken to 17 survivors who were in the engine room when the torpedoes hit, Graves pressed. Your repair held. The reduction gear was intact. The failure was in the forward compartments, exactly where the Japanese hit us. He pulled an envelope from his jacket.
I brought something for you. Inside was a letter signed by 14 former Indianapolis crewmen, engine room personnel who had witnessed Mallory's repair and survived the sinking. Their message was simple and direct. Your work saved lives. The ship made her delivery. The war ended sooner because of what you did. No man should carry blame that isn't his to bear. That conversation began a slow healing process. Mallory gradually reconnected with other Indianapolis survivors, men who knew nothing of his role in the ship's final mission, but welcomed him as someone who understood their ordeal from a unique perspective. He never revealed to most of them exactly what he had done and what he had been accused of doing. That burden remained largely his alone.
As decades passed, the Indianapolis story entered naval legend, fueled by dramatic retellings like Captain Quint's monologue in the film Jaws. Investigations continued to explore why rescue had been so delayed, how communications had broken down so catastrophically. In 1996, Captain McVeigh was posthumously exonerated by Congress after a campaign led by survivors and the captain's son. McVeigh had taken his own life in 1968, unable to escape the burden of surviving when so many under his command had perished. Thomas Mallory lived long enough to see that partial justice for the captain he had served, though his own role remained in the shadows of history. When interviewed for a naval engineering journal in 2001, at the age of 90, he finally spoke publicly about his emergency repair. The article, Unconventional Welding Techniques in Naval Emergency Situations, treated his work as a technical curiosity rather than the moral crucible it had been. The elderly welder described in clinical detail the precise method he had used, the alloy composition, the heat treatment. Only in the final paragraph did he allow himself a personal reflection. I've spent a lifetime wondering if I did the right thing. I know the repair was sound. I know the torpedoes would have sunk her regardless. But when you step outside the rules to do what you think is necessary, you accept responsibility for whatever happens after. That's the burden you carry. He died 6 months after the article was published. His modest funeral was attended by 3 Indianapolis survivors who had only recently learned of his connection to their ship. They placed a small model of the cruiser on his casket, not the pristine recruitment poster version, but a battle-worn replica showing the kamikaze damage she had sustained off Okinawa. It was the ship as Mallory had known her, wounded but still fighting, in need of someone willing to risk everything to keep her in the war. The true complexity of the Indianapolis story emerged more fully in the 21st century, as declassified documents revealed the high-level pressure to get the cruiser underway regardless of her mechanical condition. The crucial nature of her secret mission, delivering key components of Little Boy, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, had overridden normal safety considerations. The directive had come from the highest levels. The ship must sail on schedule. Thomas Mallory's unorthodox repair had not been a reckless disregard of protocol, but the only solution to an impossible demand. Naval historians now place the welder's contribution in more appropriate context. His innovative technique, performed under extreme conditions, had actually worked perfectly. The reduction gear repair had held throughout the high-speed run to Tinian, allowing the Indianapolis to deliver her world-changing cargo on schedule. By some estimates, this accelerated the war's end by months, potentially saving hundreds of thousands of American and Japanese lives that would have been lost in a land invasion of Japan. The torpedoes that sank the cruiser struck in areas completely unrelated to Mallory's repair work. The ship's rapid sinking resulted from the specific impact points and the volatile cargo she had been carrying in auxiliary magazines, not from any structural weakness introduced by emergency repairs. Yet this historical vindication came too late for the welder who had saved the ship once but couldn't save her or himself a second time. Thomas Mallory represents a particularly poignant example of how war creates impossible choices, where the line between heroism and catastrophe often depends more on circumstance than intent. He performed what many engineering experts now consider a near-miraculous repair under conditions that would break most humans. That repair helped end humanity's most destructive conflict. And yet he spent decades as the man who wondered if his pride and confidence had sent hundreds of sailors to their deaths. Perhaps the most telling testament comes from the maintenance logs of other Pacific Fleet vessels from 1945 through 1946. Naval engineers, working quietly and without official sanction, began incorporating aspects of Mallory's technique for emergency repairs. The Mallory method, though never formally acknowledged in naval documentation, spread through the fleet as a last resort approach for keeping damaged ships operational when proper facilities weren't available. His innovation lived on, saving other ships and other crews, even as its creator carried the weight of the Indianapolis like the burns that never fully healed on his hands. The USS Indianapolis National Memorial in Indianapolis, Indiana, was dedicated in 1995, honoring the ship and her crew. A small, easily overlooked notation on one panel mentions emergency repairs at Pearl Harbor that allowed the crucial mission to proceed. It is the only public acknowledgement of Thomas Mallory's role in the ship's final voyage. For visitors who know the full story, it represents both the heights of human ingenuity and the depths of unjust blame. The saga of a welder who performed the impossible when his country needed it most, then spent a lifetime wondering if he should have refused. In naval engineering classes today, instructors sometimes pose a theoretical question to students. Given the same circumstances, a critically damaged ship, an urgent war mission, and conventional repair methods that would take too long, what would you do? The answers vary, but the discussion inevitably turns to the human element of engineering decisions. The technical problems have solutions. The moral dilemmas rarely do. As for Thomas Mallory himself, perhaps he found some measure of peace in his final years. Samuel Graves, in a memoir published after both men had passed away, recalled their last conversation in 1998. "I asked him if, knowing everything that happened, he would make the same choice again," Graves wrote. "He thought for a long time before answering. The ship needed to sail," he finally said. "The war needed to end. I still had these hands, and they could do what needed doing. Some choices you make, and some make you. That repair made me who I am, for better or worse. I've carried Indianapolis with me every day since. Maybe that's the only kind of survival that matters in the end." For the men who floated 4 days in the Pacific, watching their shipmates succumb to sharks, dehydration, and exposure, survival meant something painfully literal. For the welder who enabled their final mission, survival meant something different. Learning to live with questions that have no answers, with blame that was neither fully deserved nor entirely misplaced. The USS Indianapolis remains one of history's most heartbreaking naval disasters. Thomas Mallory remains one of its hidden stories, the man who fixed what seemed unfixable, who carried the burden of hundreds of lives, and who discovered that sometimes saving others means never quite saving yourself. If this story has stayed with you, consider what it means to bear responsibility for decisions made under impossible circumstances. History remembers the Indianapolis through the lens of its tragic ending, but perhaps we should also remember those whose quiet expertise kept her sailing when the world needed her most, even when that expertise operated outside the boundaries of what was officially allowed. In war as in peace, the rules that guide us sometimes matter less than the human judgment that knows when they must be transcended, whatever the personal cost may be.